Hey everyone, today we're going to be looking at the Warrior deck. What makes the Warrior deck unique is really that it's got this toolbox because it's the only deck in the format that has a card like this called Reinforcement of the Army, otherwise known as Rhoda. Rhoda has the unique ability to search for a level 4 or lower warrior monster from your deck. If you combine this with running a bunch of different types of warriors that are good in different game states, you can use Rhoda to pull up the ideal warrior from your deck for the given situation you find yourself in. So this makes the deck extremely versatile. Right off the bat, I want to go over the most striking feature of this deck and what really has evolved the most from the old eras, and that's the ratios of monsters to spells to trap. In this deck, I'm playing 12 monsters, which is one of the lowest monster counts in a quote-unquote normal, non-combo deck. There's really a bunch of reasons and theory behind this. First of all, Rhoda itself sort of counts like a monster. Yeah, you can set it, but eventually you're going to activate it and it's going to add another monster to your hand. So really, we're almost playing 14 monsters right off the bat. So it's lighter on monsters even when we consider Rhoda than most decks. And that's because every monster in this deck gets normal summoned. There's no monster that inherently special summons itself to the field, such as Blackluster Soldier. And that's because the Warrior deck really wants to have like a very fluid opening hand. It doesn't want to have any dead cards. So the deck has almost no reliable way to generate card advantage. It's not running Chaos Monsters, it's not running Magician of Faith to recycle power spells. So really what it wants to focus on is simplifying the game and having good cards in your hand that you can play. Basically, you want to be able to play all your cards during a duel. And if you're playing a fast deck and you draw 4 monsters, your deck's really not that fast. It's going to take at least 4 turns for you to use all of your cards. That's not so good. So if we play a low monster ratio, it's going to be pretty rare that we open with 3 or more monsters. Usually we'll get like 2, I think, on average, sometimes 1. And really that's what we want. Okay, so let's go through what monsters the Warrior deck decides to play. I'll start with the Warriors. First off, Blade Knight. It's sort of the best pressure inducer in the opening game. Its attack boost is actually extremely relevant, especially against Goat Control and Chaos Control. Often in those decks you'll find them running like Abyss Soldier, Azura Priest, Breaker the Magical Warrior, maybe some skilled magicians. With the attack boost, Blade Knight is bigger than all of them. Blade Knight's attack is also extremely relevant because all it takes are 4 direct hits and the opponent's reduced to 0 life points. We can take a look at this replay to understand just how powerful Blade Knight can be at simplifying the game and putting a lot of pressure on the opponent early on. So it was sort of picking up in the early game here. A Breaker was hit by Ring of Destruction, did some damage to both players, and I decided to pass with just the Mystical Space Typhoon set to set up a Blade Knight. I don't really want to commit Blade Knight on an opening field. I'd rather sort of hold it for a flip effect monster that gets set or a beater that is not quite as big as it. So our opponent summons Abyss Soldier here to hit directly, thinking that, oh, maybe they're going to catch us on life points and clock us pretty quickly. They end by setting 1 card to back up the Abyss Soldier. We can hit it with Typhoon. And now, because our deck is playing so few monsters, and because we play Blade Knight, we can normal summon the Blade Knight, set 4 or 5 cards, actually all 5, and attack over the Abyss Soldier. Now we have 6 cards to the opponent's 4. They're going to get 5 on their turn, and every card that we have down is potentially usable in the near future. So that showed how powerful Blade Knight is at pressuring the opponent in the early game. Next warrior that's in the lineup is DD Warrior Lady. Always a solid pick. It's a really strong removal card. It's versatile. It has very good stats. You can summon it on an open board and swing confidently. And it's also useful for banishing serpents, Sangans, etc. It's also good for banishing chaos monsters. Next we have Zaloog. Zaloog is probably the best warrior to search for when you want to attack directly. It will pretty much always force the opponent to do something, either activate Scapegoat, activate a trap, activate a Book of Moon, etc. Zaloog's also fantastic at simplifying the game. Exiled Force is incredibly solid. It's a really good monster to get in the early game and kill something. It also makes Premature Burial and Call of the Haunted live immediately. The other great thing about Exiled and Call of the Haunted is that when Exiled tributes itself to destroy a monster, it will leave Call of the Haunted behind on the field, since Call of the Haunted only leaves the field when the target is destroyed. If Exiled is tributed, it's not destroyed. Leaving Call of the Haunted on the field is great for Abyss Soldier. Finally, I chose to main deck Mystic Swordsman level 2. This was the last spot I was considering. I was actually deciding between Ninja Grandmaster Sasuke and Mystic Swordsman level 2. Overall, I think that Mystic Swordsman level 2 is probably better in more of the common matchups like Chaos Flip Turbo and Flip Control, whereas Ninja Grandmaster Sasuke is really only useful against decks that main deck Gravekeeper Spy or Legendary Jujutsu Master, which there aren't really that many of. Finally, we have like the quote-unquote water package, which is really strong in simplified game states and works quite well with the warrior engine. It gives the deck some increased threat density and outs to problems it might find itself in. The water monsters also have really good stats, and they can lock the opponent quite quickly too. Sangan is also really good in aggro decks. It's one of the best beaters you can summon on an opening field. Sangan also has the ability to search for most of the warriors in the deck, just not Blade Knight. Finally, the monster lineup also includes Breaker the Magical Warrior. Warrior and aggro decks want to work through back row eventually, so why not use a Breaker that will pop a back row and potentially be a 1600 floater. That seems really good in aggro. Okay, so that's it for the monster lineup. Now let's go over the spells and traps in the deck. Of course, the deck will play the Trinity pieces, 2 Reinforcement of the Army, which is pretty much the heart of the deck. Heavy Storm and MST are pretty darn good here. Removal is always good in an aggro deck. You could make a case for not main decking Heavy Storm because you play Solemn Judgments, but I do think the ability to do a pro Heavy Storm is highly underrated in an aggro deck. You can often fake your opponent out into thinking that you have Solemn Judgment set while you really have Heavy Storm and a bunch of spells you can activate. An inexperienced opponent may often match your back row by setting 4 back row of their own, and with Heavy Storm, you can really punish that kind of play. Finally, I'm playing 3 Book of Moon and 3 Compulsory Evacuation Device. I think Book of Moon is actually really good with warriors. It's not as good with stun decks, but I do think it's great with warriors because most of the warriors have high stats, they have high defense. It also combos really well with Mystic Swordsman level 2. It's basically like playing extra copies of Sakuretsu Armor when you have a floating Mystic Swordsman level 2 on the field. Book of Moon also combos really well with Snatch Steal. Snatch Steal is one of the most powerful swing cards in the format, and it's a really effective way to generate advantage and out problematic monsters. I think that playing 3 copies of Book of Moon is enough to use Snatch Steal effectively, even though we're not main decking any tribute monsters or Tsukuyami. So next we have the trap lineup, which also works well with our Book of Moons. We have 3 Compulsory Evacuation Device to out TER. So basically the game plan for this deck is to summon a beater, attack, summon something that does a pressure, attack. You might force an activation of Scapegoat, but then when your opponent tries to follow up with Metamorphosis, you negate that play with Book, Compulsory, or Ring. So let's see how Compulsory Evacuation Device and Book of Moon work together. Here we open with 2 Book of Moon, Reinforcement of the Army, Snatch Steal, and Solemn Judgment. Our opponent is starting. They're going to set 1 and pass. Maybe that's something like Scapegoat or a Dust Tornado. So we drew into Compulsory Evacuation Device. I think it's good to go for Zaloog here and force something. Maybe we're lucky and it is a Dust Tornado. So it was in fact Scapegoat. Our opponent's going to summon 4 tokens. Now, I'm not playing anything like Azura Priest in this deck, so what I really want to do is just hit each token 1 at a time, 2 at a time if possible, and prevent every Metamorphosis play that comes along. That way, Scapegoat will eventually go -1 for the opponent, and I won't lose my monster. So I'll set 4 here with a Solemn Judgment, 3 cards that stop Metamorphosis plays, and 1 Solemn Judgment. So there's the predictable Metamorphosis. Let's hit it with Compulsory Evacuation Device. Compulse is often the best card to use against freshly summoned Thousandizer Strict, as opposed to Book of Moon, because the opponent might tribute that Thousandizer Strict that we booked for an Aeronite Parshath, and then we'd have to deal with the Aeronite Parshath. This way, we don't have to deal with Aeronite Parshath at all. Now our opponent is trying to use Snatch. Good thing we have these books. We can protect our Dawn. Dawn's stats here are pretty relevant. 1500 is actually quite high, so unless our opponent summons like an Abyss Soldier, we're in pretty good shape, though we could also book the Abyss Soldier and try to kill it in battle with our Dawn. So our opponent does summon something, but DD Warrior Lady, that's got the same attack as Dawn's defense, so our opponent's forced to use DD Warrior Lady's effect to banish. So Dawn actually took one card with it and 2 tokens, essentially. Not a bad trade. So that replay showed why Compulsory and Book are so good and work so well together to protect your one monster from Thousandizer Strict and additional follow-up plays that the opponent might have. Next, the deck has more removal, just simple spot removal that will help your plays go through, like Dust Tornado. It's also playing Sakuretsu Armor. We're not playing that many monsters. Whenever our opponent does summon something with higher stats than our monster, we will want to kill it before it kills our monster. That makes Sakuretsu Armor and Mirror Force incredibly good in this deck. I should mention, this deck is playing Revival spells, Premature Burial, and Call of the Haunted. I think this deck really needs to play these cards because it doesn't have any other monsters that act as an inherent special summon, and all its monsters are pretty good when revived. The graveyard basically becomes an additional toolbox for the warrior player, as you can Premature Burial or Call of the Haunted back any of the warriors, or Abyss Soldier and Tribe Infecting Virus, or Sangan. Pretty much your entire deck is full of monsters that are good to summon off Premature Burial or Call the Haunted, so why not play them? Finally, the last card in this list is Solemn Judgment, a card that you really have to play at 3. The reason to play Solemn Judgment at 3 in pretty much any Goat Control list is because every time you play Solemn, you have to pay half your life points. This is a steep cost in the beginning of the game when you start with 8,000 and have to pay 4,000. But after your first Solemn activation, the next and the one after that are actually much cheaper to play. They don't cost as much life points. So whenever you play Solemn, you pretty much want to play 3. Solemn works so great with the warrior deck because it has no inherent way to generate card advantage, aside from its monsters destroying others in battle, or attacking directly with a Dawn Zaloog, or of course the Abyss Soldier combos with Premature and Call of the Haunted. Aside from that, there's no way to generate advantage, so we really need to use Solemn Judgment to stop our opponent's advantage generating plays. If the opponent has more cards than us, then we don't actually want to simplify, but this deck is built to simplify, so we're kind of stuck. The best way to win those kind of games is to just prevent your opponent from getting more cards than you in the first place. That means Solemn Judgment. Solemn Judgment is pretty much the only card that can stop stuff like Pot of Greed, Delinquent Duo, Graceful Charity, and Heavy Storm that is effective in the format. There are other ways to stop these cards, but most of them involve going -1. So in this last replay, I'm going to go over how useful Solemn Judgment is for the aggro player, especially when going first, with a bunch of cards that we can set. So in this hand, we open 2 Solemn Judgment, Nobleman Crossout, Reinforcement of the Army, Compulse, and Dawn Zaloog. These are all pretty good cards that should be playable in a matchup against Control. We can start the game by setting our entire hand. Since the opponent hasn't had a turn yet, doing this play basically makes their Delinquent Duo useless if they happen to open it. Since this is presumably a blind matchup for our opponent, they're not really going to know what we're playing. They probably don't think it's aggro, maybe they think it's burn or flip control or something like that since we set a monster face down. Now normally you don't want to set a monster face down, but Dawn Zaloog is a bit of a different story. It can actually get its effect whenever it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, so that's even when it's face down defense and your opponent attacks it with something smaller like a Recruiter or a Sangan or something like that, which maybe our opponent will do. I'm not that afraid of Nobleman Crossout here because we do have Compulsory Evacuation Device to bring it back to our hand. Seems like a good play to me since no matter what our opponent does, whether they summon a monster to attack or set a monster, we have a pretty good opportunity to use Dawn Zaloog again in this duel. So in fact, our opponent did have Duo, And by setting our entire hand, we just made Duo a 1-for-1 trade. So even though we didn't have to Solemn Judgment the Duo, the fact that we played Solemn Judgment in this list led to Duo being a 1-for-1 and not a card that gained the opponent advantage that would be pretty hard for us to overcome. So our opponent ends the turn with a tea set. Not bad, all considered. Our opponent only has 4 cards, as do we. This is about as good as it gets for an aggro deck. We just have to keep simplifying until the opponent is left with a dead card or two. So now we're going to flip Rhoda. I think going for Blade Knight is the best play here. It's quite likely that our opponent set a flip effect, and Blade Knight has really high stats, especially since most of our cards are set. It's got the attack boost. We're pretty much fine unless this is like a Gravekeeper Spy. It's a Magical Merchant, and our opponent had no real back row to stop it. That's fantastic. Now we've got 5 cards while our opponent has 3. Again, it's about as ideal as it can get for an aggro deck. All thanks to the Solemn Judgment that allowed us to set our entire hand. So the opponent ends with setting 1 new back row. I think we should hit that with MST. Since we know that the first one is probably not real, since they didn't stop the merchant from dying. It was a torrential. That's cool. It would allow us to summon another monster had we drawn one, or revive Don Zaloog if we had drawn Premature Burial. Instead, we drew the 3rd Solemn Judgment. Now we'll swing, see if Goat comes down or something. It doesn't. Our opponent's on 5,000. They're getting clocked down to 0 pretty quickly, and we have 3 Solemn Judgments. I think this game is pretty much wrapped. Just use the Solemn Judgments to stop top deck cards like Pot of Greed, BLS, Graceful Charity, or cards that are used to destroy the Blade Knight in battle. We want to keep the Blade Knight on the field to keep clocking our opponent. Solemn is really quite effective in this kind of strategy, where we just want to simplify and stop our opponent from generating card advantage. So I don't have much to say about the rest of the main deck. I think it's really quite a simple deck and straightforward. I think maybe the most eye-popping thing from this deck might be the ratios, but I hope the replays that I showed demonstrate how good it is to have a low monster ratio and a high back row ratio. Finally, I want to go over the side deck. Now, I haven't played this deck all that much in competitive environments, but I do like my side deck. I think it's kind of fun. I like the theory behind it especially. So I think that Reinforcement of the Army is the greatest strength of the Warrior deck. It lets them have a toolbox, and I see no reason why we wouldn't expand that toolbox into the side deck. So most of the monsters I'm citing are Warriors that are good in like very specific matchups. I'm citing Amazoness Chainmaster, which is good against like an aggro mirror. Amazoness Chainmaster has really a wild effect. When it's destroyed in battle and sent to the graveyard, you can pay 1,500 life points, look at your opponent's hand, and add 1 monster from their hand to your hand. So if it's successful, it's basically a +1. In an aggro matchup, that's really, really good. Sure, it's costly, but you can do this early with thanks to Rhoda, and then save your Solemns for later. It won't really matter if you use Amazoness before you start using your Solemns. Next, I have DD Survivor, which happens to be really good against decks that banish. It's a pretty good option against an opponent that you see is running DD Warrior Lady, and it's a really good option against an opponent that's also running DD Assailant, perhaps another aggro player. Next, I have Cliff the Trap Remover. He's a Dark Scorpion Warrior. Again, 1,200 attack, 1,000 defense. When he inflicts battle damage to the opponent, the primary effect is that you can target one spell or trap on the field and destroy that card. That's actually really good. It happens in the damage step, so your opponent is basically forced to Sakuretsu the Cliff, or let Cliff just potentially destroy the Sakuretsu. It's also really good against back row heavy decks, and potentially I think it's good against Royal Decree, which this deck could be weak to. My side deck is sort of built in mind that some of my opponents will side Royal Decree against me, and it might be tough to combat. So I want to have additional outs, especially warriors that can destroy Royal Decree. Cliff the Trap Remover is one of those. Another warrior that can destroy Royal Decree is Trapmaster. Trapmaster is a flip effect monster that can destroy one trap on the field. You have to kind of go blind when you're selecting a face down, and if you happen to select a spell, you're out of luck. Trapmaster will do absolutely nothing. Really, I wouldn't be siding in Trapmaster unless I was pretty sure I had good targets that I really wanted to kill with Trapmaster. Another thing that's kind of cool about siding a flip effect like Trapmaster is that your opponent will most likely side out their nobleman across out against you. It's pretty much commonly accepted that you should side your noblemans out against aggro, but that allows the aggro player to side in flips, or do stuff like set their serpents and sanguines at the beginning of the game. Next, the last warrior in the side deck is Ninja Grandmaster Sasuke, probably the best one in the side deck. I thought about maining Ninja Grandmaster. It has really good stats, 1800, 1000, and it has the ability to destroy any face-up defense position monster that it battles with. So this is obviously really good against Jujutsu Master, Gravekeeper Spy, Gravekeeper's Guard, and Chaos monsters that are summoned in defense mode. You probably shouldn't be summoning your Chaos monsters in defense mode, but if you see that your opponent is, then you can side in your Ninja Grandmaster Sasuke. The final monster in the side deck is Morphing Jar. I kind of put this in on a whim, but I think it could be really good. I noticed that in Game 2 and Game 3, flip effects are really good. Sometimes the opponent won't even attack them, just assuming that it's a Sinister Serpent or a Sanguine. So that can make Morphing Jar potentially really, really good. Morphing Jar is also really good with Solemn Judgment, and it's also good with Mind Crush and Trap Dust Shoot. Morphing Jar also has a good matchup against Chaos Control and Chaos Turbo, as the Chaos Sorcerers will often sit in their hand, and you can destroy them with Morphing Jar when you activate it. Next, I have Smashing Grounds in the side. This is also in case of Royal Decree, but also in case of the Aggro Mirror, where I want to side out Nobleman across out. That's pretty much it for Smashing Ground. Very straightforward card to use. Finally, the Crush Shoot Engine. Pretty solid against combo decks. Mind Crush especially good against Dimension Fusion decks and Giant Trunade decks. Dust Tornado, really good against Chaos Turbo decks and Thunder Dragon decks. So is Mind Crush. So I think Chaos could be potentially a really hard matchup for this deck, since Chaos Sorcerers are an effective way to go plus over face-up monsters that I'm going to be summoning all the time. And I think I just need to prevent those decks from getting the ball rolling in the first place and keep materials out of the graveyard for Chaos Sorcerer to banish. These last two slots here are Dust Tornado and Widespread Ruin, but Widespread Ruin and Dust Tornado I sort of threw in for extra versatility. You know, I'd put Wide in against a fellow aggro deck, and I would put Dust in against like a burn deck or maybe a back row heavy deck, or something with Floodgates. The only other cards I would kind of consider siding in these spots right now are Royal Oppression, but at the end of the day, I just didn't really think that I wanted to play Royal Oppression. It's sort of not what my deck is doing. I'm not really trying to like put Floodgates on the board and stop my opponent from doing anything. I'm more trying to simplify, go 1-for-1, and then go plus on 1 or 2 trades with Blade Knight or Don Zaloog. Okay guys, thanks for listening to my deck profile on the Warrior deck for GOAT format. I really appreciate the comments and likes that we get on this video. It's really helping me make better videos and provide better content for the GOAT format community, and I'm really excited about that. Please visit Format Library to find a download link for this deck and additional information. I hope you guys have some fun trying out this Warrior deck.